right, we're going to get started in just 1 minute. I think we're waiting on. There we go. All right, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Daniel Castro. I'm director of the Center for Data Innovation. The Center for Data Innovation is a nonprofit, nonpartisan public policy think tank where we focus on the intersection of data technology and public policy. I want to welcome you to today's event, Accountability in the Algorithmic Economy. Before we begin, just two quick logistics. First, the event is being recorded and webcast. If you're joining us online, welcome. You're welcome to follow along with the conversation using the hashtag data innovation. We'll also have plenty of time for Q&A at the end, both for anyone in the room as well as online using that hashtag data innovation. All right, so I think many people are concerned right now about the growing use of algorithms, particularly artificial intelligence, and the risk that it will lead to consumer harm. In particular, that individuals might be discriminated against or somehow treated unfairly. So the question we want to explore during today's event is how can policymakers hold organizations accountable for how they use algorithms while also accelerating adoption of technologies like AI? This conversation is important because there's many growing attempts to automate significant parts of the economy using algorithms and using artificial intelligence. So how government ultimately chooses to regulate algorithms will have a significant impact on the economy. And I think a historical perspective here is very important. The United States has had a long-standing success in the digital economy and the various iterations of the digital economy because of its light touch regulatory approach. And we sometimes forget that this was and continues to be, a uniquely American policy. So U.S. companies succeeded in the internet economy in large part because of laws that prevented multiple and discriminatory taxes on internet access and e-commerce, and because of laws that provided intermediate liability protection for both the speech and the conduct of users. And then when we move past kind of the early internet economy into the data economy over the last decade, we've seen U.S. companies again succeeding because we've taken a light touch regulatory approach to data protection and data handling policies, and that's focused on a harms-based approach, and that's taken a sectoral-based approach. The question now is, how will we regulate the algorithmic economy? Will we go down the path of Europe with heavy-handed rules like the GDPR, or can we continue to build on the U.S. approach of using light touch regulations that will allow innovation to flourish? So the paper that we released, that we're releasing today at this event on algorithmic accountability is, I think, the first attempt to show how the U.S. can continue to build on a balanced regulatory approach for the next stage of the digital economy. We have a fantastic set of panelists here today to tell us why we're wrong and why we're right. Starting on my left, we have Lauren Smith, who's a policy counsel at the Future Privacy Forum. Neil Chilson, who's a senior fellow for technology and innovation at the Charles Koch Institute, and also the former chief technologist at the Federal Trade Commission. Frank Torres, who's director of consumer affairs at Microsoft. Nicole Turner-Lee, who's a fellow at the Center for Technology Innovation at Brookings, and Josh New, who's a policy analyst at the Center for Data Innovation. So to begin, I'm going to invite Josh to come up and spend some time giving us an overview of the report. If you didn't get a copy, we have it, of course, in the back. If you're following online, it's on our website. So we'll do an overview of the report, and then we'll jump into a conversation with the panel. Josh.
Hi. So it's a 40-page report. It started out as a 10-page explainer. Sorry about that. Yeah, so when we started out to do this, we wanted to provide just an explainer of what a framework for algorithmic accountability should look like. And then the more we worked on it, the more we realized that there were some pretty significant issues with the state of the debate around this issue. So the report kind of ballooned out from that, and I want to go through what the report tries to convince you all of much better than I can in a PowerPoint presentation. But first, the report focuses on how the proliferation of algorithms, as Daniel mentioned, particularly AI, poses some potentially significant challenges that existing laws might not be well equipped to address. But unfortunately, a lot of the proposals a lot of the proposed solutions that we've seen around these issues are severely lacking. They would stifle innovation, and in many cases wouldn't actually address the harm they're designed to protect against. And the third, we propose our new solution for algorithmic governance, which is centered around algorithmic accountability, and it's designed to serve as a guide for policymakers, regulators, and the private sector as they grapple with this issue of how to use algorithms responsibly. So first, algorithms pose some new challenges. Daniel mentioned them briefly. Concerns that these will be impenetrable black boxes, fears that organizations could use algorithms to act unethically, dominate the discussions about how policymakers should be approaching this issue. So while the likelihood of these potential harms is likely overstated, as we argue in the report, these are real concerns with potentially very significant consequences. And these challenges stem from two main factors of algorithmic decision making. Its complexity and its scalability. So some consider AI to be this black box that defies scrutiny because it can be so difficult to identify how an algorithm might be flawed or making biased decisions by looking at its actual code. In some cases, the developers can't even do that. As you can see on this image, which is a simplified model of an artificial neural network used in a lot of machine learning applications, what's going on in that hidden layer, the actual decision-making process, can be inscrutable to developers. And there are many ways for bias to enter an algorithm that can be difficult to control for. So training data could not be representative, or development teams could be homogeneous, and they might fail to identify certain factors that could introduce bias into their system. So should these flaws be present, should these biases exist, the sheer volume of an algorithm's decisions could amplify any harmful outcomes on a much larger scale than human decision making. This is a scalability challenge. So if a bank, for example, were to implement an algorithm that exhibited racial bias inadvertently for processing loan applications, they could cause harm on a much larger scale, much more quickly than simply a biased human processing a couple loan applications per week. So while these challenges are real, the solutions proposed thus far would not address them effectively. The most common of these proposals is calls for policymakers to issue broad mandates for algorithmic transparency, which is the requirement that organizations that use algorithms should expose their source code, sometimes expose their data to some degree of public scrutiny. And then similar calls for algorithmic explainability, which is requirements that firms should have to describe how their algorithms work or use algorithms that are capable of articulating their own rationales for their decisions. So these are fundamentally different concepts, but they are flawed for many of the same reasons. The report goes very in-depth on all of their flaws, but I want to talk about a couple important ones here today. So first, requirements for transparency and explainability are already exist in many sectors. These are not new concepts. Consumer finance, for example, there are explainability requirements for certain kinds of decisions. But a lot of supporters of proposals for algorithmic explainability or transparency would apply these requirements to all algorithmic decision making, even when that same requirement doesn't exist for a human decision in the same context. So that's holding algorithms to a standard that simply just does not exist for humans. And if a firm could use a human for this kind of decision instead of an algorithm, if they want to minimize the regulatory burden, they would simply use algorithms less or not use them at all, which comes at the expense of productivity. Secondly, explainability can be really technically challenging for a lot of advanced AI systems because accuracy typically scales with complexity. However, this comes at the cost of interpretability. And there are very few situations where a reduction in accuracy would ever be desirable. In healthcare, for example, even minor reductions in accuracy could be potentially catastrophic. So a requirement for explainability in these applications that use advanced AI would essentially either be a requirement to use less effective AI systems, or it would prohibit the use of AI altogether if accuracy is paramount and can't be sacrificed. Third, AI can be incredibly complex, as I mentioned, to the point where even its developers cannot articulate how its source code results in certain decisions. So exposing this code and underlying data to regulators or the public, it's simply unrealistic to expect that they'd be able to understand this code, and it raises a host of intellectual property and other concerns. So in situations, however, when the code is interpretable, when it doesn't use machine learning, for example, disclosing how an algorithm works through transparency, through explainability, could enable bad actors to take advantage of algorithm-driven platforms. So Angela Merkel here speaking earlier this year suggested that we need algorithmic transparency So people can understand how algorithm-driven platforms provide content either on news feeds or search results, for example, so that people using these platforms can understand how their opinions might be influenced. This is an understandable concern, but I'm sure many of you remember years ago Google bombing. So Google's page ranking algorithm used to be pretty widely understood how that worked, and bad actors could deliberately point users to bad or misleading content. So transparency in those kind of contexts would make it easier to kind of hijack these systems for bad actors, and would make the problem that Merkle identifies worse and not actually better. So as I'll explain later, transparency and explainability are really useful concepts in our overall framework for algorithmic explainability, but only in very select cases, and then actually be ineffective or harmful in others. So the next kind of proposals that we debunk are can be described as these calls for master regulatory bodies to oversee all algorithmic decision making. Supporters of this idea, most notably Elon Musk, here at the NGA meeting last summer, they want to establish the equivalent of an FDA or a National Transportation Safety Board for algorithms, so they can scrutinize the technology and sometimes even pre-certify it to make sure that it's safe. This ignores a really key issue here. Regulators need to have context-specific expertise to be effective. So algorithms are a decision-making tool, but the context of each of their decisions can be wildly different. Consumer finance, medical diagnostic, college admissions all involve wildly different factors. And that's why governments rely on a wide variety of different kinds of regulators to address each of these issues according to their sector, and not one master regulator to regulate all of human decision-making. But in some cases, the concern seems to be that regulators don't have the necessary technical expertise to understand algorithms. This has always been a challenge, and regulators have always had to adapt to new technologies. But if for whatever reason they think that this is an insurmountable challenge here, simply establishing a new regulator wouldn't somehow magic this expertise into existence. Third, there's a category of proposals that are, they rely heavily on platitudes, buzzwords, and these kind of vague truisms that a lot of times sound innocuous or even desirable, but they don't translate into effective governance or policy. So these are pretty common because it's easy to identify how algorithms could go wrong and urge caution, which is important, but it's very difficult to articulate a meaningful strategy to mitigate these risks. So Theresa May was very guilty of this earlier this year at her speech at Davos when she gave a speech about how we need to be careful about AI, and it boiled down to AI is important and valuable, but we need to make sure it's safe. And of course that's true. No one's disagreeing with that, but that doesn't give policymakers or people using algorithms really anything to work with. So similarly, in May 2016, the White House published a report on big data and civil rights where they defined this concept of equal opportunity by design. It was a principle of ensuring fairness and guarding against discrimination in an algorithmic system. And this was echoed a little bit later by then Federal Trade Commissioner Terrell McSweeney, who advocated for responsibility by design, which called on developers to try to correct the root causes of potential harms, so biased historical training data, for example. And so these are good things. They sound nice, they're worthwhile, but simply stating that developers should consider responsibility by design is not really a clear solution to the challenge that algorithms pose. For example, or furthermore, a lot of these approaches focus on the developer, which is important. Developers should care about this, but developers actually have very little say in how their technology is used in the world. So a developer could embrace responsibility by design to the utmost, but if someone using their algorithm uses it in a different way, that's going to be a futile effort. Finally, the last category that we address is the do-nothing approach. So it's definitely reasonable to be skeptical of efforts to rush to regulate new technologies because of concerns about their hypothetical harms or what they might be able to do one day without evidence. But with algorithms, dismissing efforts to improve governance in any and all cases would be really problematic. So to be sure, algorithms don't always need more oversight. Because in many cases there are some pretty substantial market forces that encourage firms to arrive at desirable outcomes. So a bank using that biased loan application algorithm, for example, would lose a lot of money if they're making just biased decisions and denying loans to people that qualify for them or granting them to people who do not. They have a very strong incentive to get this right. Similarly, in a lot of cases, there's going to be consumer feedback and outrage that will pressure companies to have the most responsible systems possible. So self-driving cars, for example, no consumer is going to get in a car if they perceive it not to be safe. And if one company's autonomous cars are perceived to be not as safe as others, they would very quickly lose market share. And then also, a lot of harms that algorithms pose are going to be minimal and not worthy of regulatory oversight. So a dating app, for example, that uses AI, likely the worst possible harm it could result in is bad or no dates, and that is not really what regulators should be concerned about. However, so in situations where the harms are significant and these market forces are muted, it can absolutely be necessary for regulators to intervene. So in public sector procurement, for example, traditional market signals are a lot less relevant. So while a flawed algorithm is an objectively bad product, these kind of contexts, that would not influence whether or not an organization actually deploys that algorithm, which could cause a lot of problems. So these are situations where the damage of a flawed decision is not borne by the person using the algorithm. So, for example, as you can see in this image, ProPublica did an investigation into a risk assessment algorithm called Compass, and found that it's used to determine recidivism risk, and it found that it exhibited some pretty significant racial bias because it was trained on biased historical data. The court systems that are using Compass and other similar systems have experienced very little harm when they make a flawed decision from these algorithms. So they don't really have a strong incentive to change or get it right here. That is where specific regulatory oversight can be necessary. So the alternative to all these bad ideas that I just described is, first of all, it focuses on the operator. So it's the organization responsible for deploying an algorithm because they have much more influence in how it's used in the real world than the algorithm's developer does. And then secondly, it's focused on the principle of algorithmic accountability, which we defined as the principle that an algorithmic system should employ a variety of controls to ensure that an operator can verify it acts in accordance with their intentions and can also identify and rectify harmful outcomes. So let's break down how that works. There are a variety of different technical and procedural mechanisms that an operator could use to ensure that they meet these kind of standards. As I mentioned, transparency and explainability could be applicable here in some contexts. Risk assessment algorithms that I mentioned, like Compass, are relatively static. They don't use machine learning. It's pretty easy to understand, at least with today's technology, it's easy to understand how they make decisions based on scrutinizing their source code. Transparency could be a valid method of ensuring that you can verify that it's acting in accordance with your intentions. Similarly, impact assessments are a useful tool. So just like policymakers use impact assessments to determine the political or economic or social implications of a policy, you can conduct impact assessments for an algorithm. These are going to be highly contextual, but like a policy impact assessment, they can be ex ante, happening before you deploy it, or ex post, which is continuous or historical analysis. So to explain what this all means, I want to walk you through how a regulator might apply this standard and why this approach makes more sense than the other ones that I've identified. So this chart is going to be like the regulator's thought process. So from the starting point, this is to be used when an operator uses an algorithm in a way that violates the law and causes significant harm or consumer injury. So at this point, regulators should examine if and how effectively an operator could demonstrate that the algorithm was acting as they intended it to. That's going to be that first step right there. If the operator used appropriate controls to do this, like confidence measures, transparency, or procedural regularity, the ones I had mentioned on the previous slide, a regulator could determine that an operator was not acting with negligence or intent to harm. If these controls weren't present, or if the operator was using them only superficially, the regulator could subject the operator to higher levels of penalties. Next, the second level here, the regulator should conduct a similar analysis of if and how effectively an operator could identify and rectify harmful outcomes. If they could, and they did, a regulator could determine that the operator took responsible steps to minimize harms from their algorithm, and if they did not, they would again be subject to a higher level of penalty. So if there's no significant harm to begin with, if it's not worthy of being brought before a regulator, there's no penalty. That's before you even get started. If the operator meets the standard of algorithmic accountability fully, which is the bottom left outcome, there would be low or no penalty depending on other factors of the case. If they met the standard partially, like they achieved one standard and not the other, they would be subject to a medium level of penalty. And if they failed to meet the standard entirely, they would be subject to the highest levels of penalty possible. So enforcing algorithmic accountability in this way would have some really important spin-off benefits. So if operators know that this framework exists, for example, they can take proactive steps to ensure that they are doing whatever they can to meet this standard, such as by modifying their existing systems or by discontinuing the use of algorithms that can't meet these standards. So operators have a really strong incentive to do this because they don't want to run afoul of regulators should their algorithms cause harm. Similarly, this would send a really strong market signal to developers about what their customers will expect of an algorithmic system that they want to buy. So developers could either provide algorithms with these necessary controls, or if they don't, they would quickly lose market share to another competitor that does so. So in terms of steps for policymakers, first and foremost, U.S. regulatory agencies should adopt the standard for algorithmic accountability and apply it as they evaluate harms from algorithms. But importantly, the federal government should advocate for the adoption of this kind of standard internationally to push back against support for a lot of GDPR-style approaches, or support for the previous flawed proposals that I mentioned that can be pretty popular around the world. Second, policymakers should implement specific statutes for algorithmic accountability in contexts where market forces don't encourage adherence to the standard. Criminal justice, public sector applications, for example, are going to be particularly relevant here. Third, regulators should make sure that they have the necessary technical expertise to understand algorithmic decision-making within their own sector. So this could involve fostering relationships with developers, with academia, with civil society, and private sector or users of these algorithms. And then importantly, policymakers should ensure that regulators have the resources necessary to hire staff with the technical expertise to actually make this happen. And then finally, policymakers should support R&D efforts to expand and develop new ways of achieving algorithmic accountability. We're already starting to do this a little bit. DARPA, for example, has a program called XAI, which is devoted to developing ways for advanced AI systems to explain themselves without reducing their accuracy, which would be, it would make it a lot easier to use these kind of complex systems in really critical sectors. So in conclusion, there's been other groups have tried to articulate what algorithmic accountability means, and many of them make good points, but a lot of them fall short of actually describing how you operationalize it. As Daniel mentioned, we think this is the first effort to do that. So the framework that we lay out here in this report provides users of algorithms and regulators alike with pretty clear rules about how to maximize the benefits of algorithmic decision making, while also narrowly targeting and preventing harmful outcomes. So this is important because it's we think the first meaningful alternative to these kind of EU-style approaches such as the GDPR, which would stifle innovation, discourage the use of algorithms generally, and largely fail to address the very real problems at stake here. So thanks for that. The report is available on our website, or we have printed copies out back. Feel free to email me or tweet at me, only if it's praise for the report. But thanks, and I look forward to the discussion.
Thank you, Josh. So I want to turn to the panel and start with reactions. I think maybe I can kind of queue it up. We'll just go down the line. But maybe the starting place, I think there's probably agreement on the panel, as Josh said. Most people don't really dispute that there are potential biases and problems with algorithms. The question we really want to focus on, I think, in the conversation today is how do we strike that balance between addressing the problems and ensuring that innovation can flourish? And I know each of you have thought very deeply about this question and your work. So why don't we start there? How do we find the balance, and what kind of approaches would strike that balance? I'll start with you.
Yeah, so I think this is a really interesting report. I think you covered a lot of ground in this topic, and it's a very helpful step forward. I think the way that we have gone about thinking about this is trying to identify first sort of what are the harms that we are trying to prevent? What are the harms that we're concerned about? Some of the conversations in this area, often we wind up conflating definitions where you're talking about causes and outcomes and harms, and sort of the conversations often become sort of mired in these definitional challenges. And I think that the proposal you put forward is a very helpful way to sort of take this next step in the conversation where, so I was at in the Obama White House when we first did the big data report, and this is one of the most surprising topics that I think came up to folks, was that the intersection of civil rights and technology, law, and policy was really going to become an important issue to focus on, sort of to understand how to look forward for civil rights type harms going into the 21st century. We need to ensure there are technologists in the policy conversations and ensure that the policy folks understand the technology. So I think that's really important. But what I think would try to highlight is that depending on the types of harms that you are focused on, the solutions may wind up being different. So there's certainly a set of harms for which we sort of have clear societal agreement that we want to ensure don't happen in any in any context. So we have, obviously civil rights laws that say, there are certain outcomes that we should absolutely prevent. And the way that we arrive at those outcomes is now evolving based on the growing use of technology. But addressing and mitigating those harms, I think, will look very different than other harms that we talk about in a recent report that we did, where there's sort of less clear societal consensus. So say things like filter bubbles or stereotype reinforcement that can be very real harms that arise because of this growing use of data. I think that the way we should go about mitigating and addressing those harms will look very different, and sort of the way that algorithms need to be understood or explained or held accountable will sort of look very different from whether you're looking at these sort of clear, legally defined, societally agreed upon aspects that we want to prevent versus some more complex issues that arise in the context of technology. And I think for companies operating in this space, it's helpful to sort of draw clear lines around the different ways we approach those issues, so that they can go forward with innovation in a way that is consistent with the way we've gone about dealing with these issues in the past.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Lauren. Neil, I mean, coming from the FTC, where you saw kind of firsthand how people were thinking about those issues, and now you're kind of on the outside thinking about it. What's your take?
So thanks for having me here, and I think this is a really important topic, and I really do appreciate the approach that CDI has taken to this at CKI, Charles Koch Institute. Very interested in exploring what legal and cultural frameworks best enable people to innovate and to make our lives better. And in my previous role at the FTC, we were very interested in that as well. The FTC actually addressed a lot of these questions, not with the language of algorithmic accountability, but in the conversation about big data. And that was the sort of buzzword of the day, and then it sort of shifted into artificial intelligence. But when the FTC came out with the big data report, it explored a lot of these questions of bias. How might it occur? What might the harms be? What approaches can we take to address those concerns? And how can we ensure that innovation continues, that we get the benefits from big data and from artificial intelligence without, and while still addressing harms that come up. And so I think the framework here is right. We need to balance those two. And the FTC's approach, in many ways, looks a lot like the flowchart that you had there, and not identical. But it does have a focus on consumer injury, which I do think is the important part. And Lauren, you mentioned that as well. If we start at the end, and if we start about what we're trying to prevent, and as well as what benefits we're trying to reach, much more than the focus on the methods, I think that leads to better policy. I think often we can get caught up in trying to write rules that try to cover every possible situation. But if we write rules that say, if you harm consumers, you're going to have a challenge with legal compliance, I think that's where, if we aim at the end, that works a little better. And I think this framework does a good job of focusing on that. I also like the focus on the operators rather than developers. When we're talking about market incentives, which I think is generally the greatest justification for regulatory intervention, is when the market is not able to solve a problem. I would say we should focus on the people who have the wrong incentives, and often that will be the person who's using the algorithm and not the person who has written the algorithm. On top of that, there's all sorts of practical problems with holding somebody who created an algorithm accountable for how an operator uses it, when often, especially in deep learning contexts, it's hard to tell the difference between the algorithm and the data that a user might bring to it. So, I think that's a great focus. I also think teasing out the difference between government uses and commercial uses is really important. And this is something that the FTC did not touch on in its big data report, because the FTC is focused on commercial behavior. The incentives are wildly different in government and in criminal justice, and I think the report did a good job of laying that out. So I think that's mostly praise for the report, and I think lines up. I'm still not sure about the language around algorithmic accountability, and also it can be hard to tell. I think sometimes this is a very complicated area, and it can be hard to tell what should be best practices, what should be recommendations, and what should be actual requirements. And I think that is that's where the hard work is to be done around figuring out a way to operationalize this. But I think this is a good step in that direction.
Thank you. Frank, let me invite you into this conversation. I mean, you've been dealing with, the privacy debate for so long, and, increasingly I think the privacy debate's evolving into, the algorithm debate. I don't know if that's just job security for a lot of people or if it's a natural evolution. But I think there's so many parallels, when we're thinking about striking that right balance. And you've been thinking about that balance for a long time, so.
Yeah, that's very true. Well, first of all, thank you for having me here. This is a very important discussion, as my other colleagues have said up here, and certainly one that helps further the debate, and I think, or further the discussion towards finding the right solutions. I mean, I think, as you all listed the challenges of other approaches that have been put on the table, I think part of it is regulators, policymakers. This is a new landscape, a new kind of era. A lot of folks, not just policymakers, but others, aren't technically savvy. I get to hang around one of our top AI researchers on a number of different issues, and I'm constantly learning from him. I was actually in a cab with him and some top researchers from some other companies, and they were talking about algorithms and how they're working, and they're getting into the mathematics behind it. And I took calculus in college, and I was lost after 5 minutes. I just stood, and we were in San Francisco, and I was just like admiring the sights as they were going on. I mean, this stuff is complicated. And then to try to operationalize it. I mean, the other thing about working at Microsoft, and I encountered this in the years working on privacy, you can come up with the best principles, and you take it back to the company, and the engineers say, what am I supposed to do with this principle? Like, how am I supposed to operationalize this? Help me, kind of, let's work together and sort this out. And what I'm seeing happen around artificial intelligence and issues like accountability, explainability, transparency, those sorts of things, as they all start to munch together, is engineers and researchers being part of the discussion to help sort this out. How to make it happen. One of my big takeaways from the report is I think the goals are the same as all of the policymakers that you all cited that may not have the methods quite right, or may have some ideas that could potentially stifle innovation, yet the outcomes, their goals of what they are looking for are right, and that's everybody recognizes the benefits of artificial intelligence. I don't think I've been in a conversation with anyone, including folks from civil society all across the spectrum, that don't recognize the promise. At the same time, they also recognize the potential harm and the need to do something about that. And what does that mean? I mean, I picked up this report in the back too. I don't think I'd seen this before, which is probably my fault. But it just lists some of the great potential for AI and actually how it's being used today. But at the same time, in Microsoft, we put out a book a couple of months ago called The Future Computed, where we call out a lot of the benefits, but also called out some challenges and started to articulate some very high-level principles about how to go about addressing those. And then, of course, the next step is how to make this all real in terms of really building it in, and accountability or explainability is very important, especially, and as you recognize in the report, where people's lives are impacted. If you're in the criminal justice system and a judge is using an algorithm to determine whether or not you get bail, being able to know how that decision was made could be very important to you. And so how and I'm not saying kind of show the algorithm, because that's not going to do anybody any good, I don't think. But explain kind of what went into it. it's very important, and I think the report does a good job of calling out the scale. I mean, I may not care if I get a goofy ad for dresses, and I'm a male, and maybe the algorithm got it wrong. No harm, no foul. I may laugh at it, and that's it. But if I get denied a loan, if I get denied a job, and it's based upon an algorithm, how do we translate even some of the existing laws that exist to protect against that, like the Fair Credit Reporting Act and anti-discrimination laws, into kind of the algorithmic context? So I think that there's some interesting questions there. At Microsoft, we've started what's called the Ether Committee, which is essentially our ethics review board, if you will, our internal process for helping our teams across the company look at sensitive uses, looking at safety critical applications of AI, and what should the parameters around those be throughout the development of the algorithm, the training, the data that goes in, the training data sets. How do you do this assessment? I know one of our researchers, Kate Crawford, also does some work with this group called AI Now, and they recently put out their report on algorithmic impact assessments for government use, and it calls for self-assessments and audits through the process, and actually kind of the notion of this post-market review as well. And so maybe thinking about it all in terms of kind of the life cycle, and how are you accountable across the life cycle of the algorithm is important, especially for companies. I know it might not apply in all cases where an algorithm is just put out there and people come and use it, but if it's within the scope of what the company is doing, there's probably some responsibility there. So I probably talked long enough. There are some other groups kind of struggling with this question, though. Microsoft was one of the founding members of a group called the Partnership for AI. They recently established some working groups. One of them is around accountability. I forget what the name of it is now, but it's tackling the accountability kind of fairness question. And there's some other working groups also established and more on the way, but also kind of bringing in top researchers, civil society groups, other NGOs, academics, because all stakeholders need to be part of this discussion as we come up with the societal parameters, whether it be kind of the norms, the best practices, or the legal frameworks that may be necessary. It needs to be that sort of discussion, and that's how we propel things forward. So glad to be here, and this is a great contribution to moving things forward and helping put a finer point on I think what have been some high-level things, and now everybody's starting to drill down a little bit. So this is important. The other one other thing I've noticed in the discussion around artificial intelligence is, I remember back in the day, I'm dating myself, Ira Magazine, or hands off the internet, don't touch it, no laws, no rules, no how, no way, never. And now everybody's saying, okay, now may not be the right time. There needs to be a lot of thought that goes into what happens. Let's see how the technology develops, how it's used. Keep in mind, the harmful effects, and making sure that, we're able to deal with those. But what I haven't heard is no law, no how, no way. There might be an appropriate place for regulation where there's a harm, or some parameters, more kind of structured legal parameters put in. And I think having that balanced, right, thoughtful approach that we're able to do now will be extremely important to both help instill trust in artificial intelligence and all the benefits that it brings, but also protect against the harms that we all care about.
Thank you, Frank. Nicole, I'd love your reaction on this. I mean, I know we've had conversations, dating back some years about, the challenges that arise when, different people have algorithms being used about them, and there's different availability of data, different types of data, and the impact that can have. I mean, Frank, to your point, we put out this report on all the great uses of AI. We actually did one of the first reports on all the potential risk of AI, and the point of that report, we wanted to be the first ones out there, saying that there are all these risks, and saying that that doesn't mean we shouldn't be moving forward, but we need to be thinking immediately about how do we address these in a positive kind of positive way. But so Nicole, I'd love to kind of get your reaction both on the report and this conversation we're having.
Yeah, so first, thank you for having me here. And I have to always go back to Dan's coining of data deserts. You remember? Long ago, I think that's
Right.
when we first started talking. So years ago, he said data deserts, and now we have data as a natural resource for everything that we do. And it's a totally different conversation, less than a decade. So I actually want to say I think the report was actually fine-tuned, like Frank said, several points that many of us who are looking at this area sort of wondering about, particularly in this era where we're not talking about straight coding, but we're talking about procedures that actually are more flexible and agile because they pick up the meta tags, they pick up our behaviors and our digital dossier and fingerprints to sort of shape this outcome. I'd like to say that bias is real. You know, when we think about bias as it's related to when we looked at the COMPAS algorithm and predictive analytics when it comes to sentencing and bail, it's been proven that bias, racial bias, is actually concealed in the COMPAS algorithm, which results in more arrests among African Americans and other minorities than any other groups based on that consistent concealment of racial bias. When we talk about bias in terms of implicit bias when it comes to training data, it's been researched and concluded that search inquiries could actually render disparate results. Last year or 2 years ago, a Google search, a very innocuous search of happy teenagers, rendered white teenagers with smiles and black teenagers with mugshots. And that has been a consistent pattern of how bias plays out based on what searches are being done on the internet and how that information is being curated. When we think about the embedding of data, racial bias in training data, it's been proven that apps that do photoshopping, like FaceApp, have consistently lightened the skin tones of African Americans or other darker minorities because the training data is primarily represented by Europeans. So it's not unlike, and when the data scientist was asked, why is this happening where people's faces were slimming and their skin tones were lightening, he said our training data didn't have enough people of color in it to actually render that result. So I would say bias is real. And we're seeing it show up in a variety of consequences, and I think the paper's right on that we have to have this conversation around accountability. Who's liable? I was in the UK last year, and I thought one of the most poignant questions around algorithms came up from one of the participants, which was, who is liable for the algorithm? Is it the data scientist? Is it the operator? Is it in some way, you know, a bad actor that's sort of maneuvering it to manipulate elections and other things that we're actually seeing? And I think the paper sort of deals with, you know, potentially it could be the operator. I would suggest that I think it's actually shared responsibility by the developer. The lack of diversity contributes to this lack of diversity in design, which is why you have what I call the 3 Ds: disparate impact, disparate treatment, and disparate error that actually comes from the algorithm when it's applied to a certain circumstance. So I try to explain to people in layperson's term. The data scientists may come with this very purist, as a PhD I can actually say this and others, purist note. They don't have to go through the same scrutiny that I have to if I'm trying to generate a research paper. They can go based on the real life experiences of what's actually happening in the digital ecology. But how that algorithm applies to different people actually creates an unintended consequence, which is why I think the paper did a good job of pointing to the black box. The black box doesn't have a way to mitigate out of that era. And that, as a result, lends itself to these impacts. LaTanya Sweeney was at the FTC because Neil was there. I did a panel 5-6 years ago when we looked at the civil rights implications of algorithms and big data. She once showed this demonstration of a black fraternity that was celebrating its 100th year anniversary. It was a mega sci-fi. And as we were all anxiously watching this demo, because we didn't know what she was going to show us 5 years ago, ads with the highest interest rate for credit cards and get your arrest record actually showed up as the pop-ups that were on this particular demonstration. So, you know, bias is real. It's actually in there. But I think developers do have some responsibility as well as we think about, you know, how do we start to remedy that, which I think leads to, the second part of your question and what we've heard from all the panelists. So how do you balance regulation with innovation? I mean, at Brookings, we're actually working on a paper. We did a roundtable of data scientists in the Bay Area. We did a roundtable here in Washington, D.C. with data science as well as groups that are privacy advocates and others that are working on this. There's a clear misunderstanding between the unintended consequences and the social outputs and what data scientists actually see as the computation. they're not talking to each other. So I do agree. Regulators have no clue on how to get under the hood. And if they did, they really wouldn't know how. And I'm sure we'll talk a little bit about how you remedy that. But the challenge is when you're actually looking at algorithmic accountability, and I would couple that with fairness, algorithmic fairness, you really have to look at the intended audience. You have to pay special attention, I think you've kind of said it, Frank, to protected classes. What is the potential impact on certain groups of people? Edith Ramirez once talked about and Neil, you remember this, the Target case was less to do about Target and more to do with the fact that the young lady was pregnant before her daddy knew, right? And so, right, it's one of the, you said it always happens that way, but it's one of those things, we'll leave that for another panel, but it's one of those things where we have to actually think about the audience, and we do have to look at gradations of harm on protected groups. And where is it that we have to be a little bit more cautious about that? I think we also have to look into, the paper begins to look into that, and this is the point of our paper, so hopefully we can kind of combine these, right? Mitigation strategy. So where do you correct the mistake? Do you correct it in the onset? Do you have, and I think this is where the innovation comes in, do you have a set of hypotheticals that data scientists are sort of constrained to, that they can't do, you know, the chokehold of what you can't do, which then stifles the innovation? Because we all know having an algorithm makes it so much easier when it comes to what the human mind cannot actually solve. That's why artificial intelligence, to people like all of us that are here, is really fascinating, because the rate in which the decision making and problem solving can happen is so quick that it's going to have positive effects on precision medicine and education, etc. This hairy area, when algorithmic decision making is used in higher education and picks out good kids versus bad kids and takes out their externalities as a decision factor, that's a problem, right? So again, I think it's one of those areas where we have to figure out what's the audience, what's the potential, and I like the way the paper lays out the gradations of harm when it comes to the regulatory regime, but what's the gradations of harm when it comes from you looking for the red dress for somebody, right? And me looking for the red dress. And is that an innocuous display or employment of an algorithm versus whether or not that has unintended consequences that limits credit, limits loans, limits your ability to get into a good school, live in a good neighborhood, et cetera. So I think as we go forward, I think the greatest challenge, and there have been some cases, you know, New York and de Blasio's idea, well, let's have a task force that can look under the hood with people who don't know anything about data science, is just not going to work, right? From the standpoint of they don't know what they're going to be looking for. Allegheny, Pennsylvania, who said, well, we'll put a chief data scientist on staff, and then we'll create, in their case, they created an algorithm to help them sort of vet through all of the calls, the hundreds of thousands of calls that come through their child abuse hotline. Non-physical abuse, an algorithm is actually deployed to answer those calls. But they have a data science that can actually pinpoint where the harm is actually happening along the process. That's something I think with regulators, and in my discussions with them, they have no clue on how to navigate this. But the challenge is, if we don't balance it like the paper's suggesting, they get the output of it. And I call that's the social impact of the algorithm, which makes it too late because the harm has already been done. So I think going forward in this conversation, we have to figure out, you know, the education is one, but where along the food chain, the supply chain, do we actually go into the black box? Or do we find ways, in our case, what we're talking about, we've got several policy pieces, but, you know, regulatory safe harbors, experimentation, more collaboration, that kind of stuff. But where do you bring in the right people, your policy people and your data scientists, to actually figure this out?
Yeah.
It's the beginning.
Great. Well, so all of you have raised great points, and I want to pick up a few threads. So the first I want to start with that I think everyone actually mentioned from a kind of a different angle. Lauren, you talked about the gray areas of value. Neil, you talked about the you know, how CKI is interested in some of the culture that affects you know, the harms that can be created and innovation as well. And Nicole and Frank, you both talked about, you know, basically what would be, I would consider, you know, things that are bad but not necessarily illegal, right? Which is this large scope of area, which I think is always very troubling for policymakers. And when we're talking about finding this balance, because it's the question of, well, you know, there are these things that we, you know, most of us would agree is bad, but there's a question of, do we want to actually legislate in this area and say that there needs to be a law saying you can do something. So what I'd like to do is just let us focus on that particular question. Let me have maybe Josh start off with a little bit about how algorithmic accountability attempts to address that, because I think part of finding the balance and part of the value of algorithmic accountability is it's saying if you're operating an algorithm, you should strive to be you should be strive to understanding, is your algorithm doing what it says it's going to be doing, and is it causing harms, and there's various incentives about how to do that, but ideally someone's recognizing that, and and then it gets to some of these culture questions. But Josh, why don't you kind of walk through how this might apply?
So we address this in the report, and I think those are all good points to get up, because that is really like the trickiest challenge to solve here. So in that flowchart that I mentioned, when the process of the regulator evaluating whether or not an operator was acting with negligence, or they were responsibly minimizing harms, or they had intent to harm, they could very well find that though there was a significant harm, the operator was doing everything they could responsibly. That's basically like an accidents happen situation, still undesirable for social or economic reasons, but they weren't necessarily breaking the law. So what should happen there is, and this of course will vary based on context, but what we describe in the report is a model somewhat similar to how aircraft accidents are investigated. So should a plane crash, the FAA and the National Transportation Safety Board will investigate. In many cases they find that the pilot wasn't drunk, they weren't flying illegally or anything, but there were opportunities to avoid that mistake in the future. They could do things a little bit differently. They're not legally required to do so, but these are recommendations that you should take if you want to minimize harms in the future. All these reports are public. Airline operators, of course, value these immensely because they don't want their planes crashing. So in these kind of contexts, applying that to an algorithmic situation. So the recent Uber crash in Arizona, where a self-driving Uber struck a pedestrian and killed her. There's a lot of questions about whether or not Uber was liable. I think they found out that Uber's human driver ready to take over was at fault. But regardless, in that kind of context, a responsible driver doing everything right could accidentally strike and kill someone who's jaywalking and not break the law. That's clearly still an undesirable outcome. And in an algorithmic system that embraces this kind of approach, you would have steps in place to identify when that could happen and fix those outcomes. And should an investigation reveal, here's what you could have done better, even though you weren't breaking the law, the operator should have a responsibility to adopt those recommendations. And should that situation happen again, they didn't implement those, the regulator could figure out, oh, you weren't responsibly trying to minimize harms as best as possible, you're at fault here. So that approach, I guess, is a little bit less clear when you're talking about some more abstract social values and a lot of cultural issues. But I think that way of approaching the issue could be really valuable here.
Yeah, Frank, I want to invite you in. I mean, Nicole was kind by not mentioning Bing as being responsible for any of these. But I'm sure this is something that Microsoft thinks about, and and is aware that search can go wrong sometimes and create misleading perceptions. How should a company be thinking about those impacts that are not always as we talk about, some impacts are clearly, there's more of a market force. So if you're getting inaccurate results in buying shoes, that's going to impact immediately the company, and you change that. Some of these other signals that have cultural effects don't maybe have those same feedback loops. How do you think about incorporating them?
Yeah, so yeah, just to separate it, there's kind of the business end of it. If people aren't getting the ads that they're clicking on, then certainly that's something that's fixable. But more to the point that was raised, I mean, when it's a biased decision that may, you only see certain types of ads that might not expose you to certain opportunities. That might not necessarily be illegal, but I would suggest that it's not also a very good result. And so what do you do about that? And part of the issue is, I'm sure, the folks at Google, Bing, whoever, is, driving the ad, saying LaTanya Sweeney's example, they probably didn't program the algorithm to kind of deliver that result. The algorithm's learning as it goes along, and it's making these comparisons. So the question does become, what happens when you find out about it? Well, how do you prevent it in the first place, right? And that depends upon kind of, it could be, I did a fellowship at Data and Society, and one of the most powerful presentations we saw, they had outside speakers come in, was a picture of, and they didn't name the company, it was basically a room of coders at a company coding whatever they were coding, and it was white guys between the ages of 21 and 35. It's like they're going to have their natural bias. They're not coming into it, hopefully not intentionally, like going, oh, we're going to write it this way or that way, but it just naturally comes out. So I mean, this is too broad a discussion maybe for this room, but like, how do you get more diversity in the coding? I mean, but those are questions that that we really take to heart at Microsoft, because that there's a legal responsibility or the potential legal responsibility, but there's also this societal thing where, as a responsible company, how do you kind of stand up? What do you do for your own sort of best practices? How do you develop those? How do you bring more diversity into the workforce when it matters, to avoid questions of say, bias and fairness? And it's complicated. It's not so easy.
Let me push you a little bit more on that, because I agree that obviously the diversity in the company is important, but that's a long problem for a lot of companies, right? It's not something, as much as we want it to be addressed overnight, it hasn't been addressed overnight. We've been trying to work on it, and we're still struggling with that. So what can we do now? What should companies be thinking about in the short term to should they be working to identify certain types of problems? How do they prioritize, what they're looking at? How are you guys thinking about those types of challenges? Because I think it's really hard, especially for small companies that don't have the resources.
Yeah, so so part of it is through the work of the Ether Committee and now others in the company, trying to say, okay, we really need to be, especially in sensitive areas or areas that are identified as potentially having kind of sensitive, results coming out that are impactful. How do you take care to look at the data, the training data, to make sure that it is well representative? So that helps, train the algorithm so you get, better outcomes that again are more representative, and then once you've got the algorithm and it's being deployed, how do you do kind of that, if you will, kind of that market assessment? How do you do that continuously? And as the, you hear the talk about, sometimes it's difficult to explain at some point for very complicated algorithms how the algorithms are actually working. Kind of they learn as they go, but how do you continuously assess the output, the outcomes, to make sure that it's not having a disparate impact, or not having an impact that you might not want?
Yeah. Lauren, especially some of your work on self-driving cars and the regulatory monitor there is all about that kind of continuous monitoring. Do you think that will work? How are you thinking about that type of issue?
Yeah, so I think what this flowchart really gets right and highlights is that there should be incentives for companies to proactively address and interrogate these questions and issues internally. Mm-hmm. And so what exactly that looks like from a regulator perspective, I think, is sort of still to be determined. I think companies haven't answered this question. There are a number of good ideas on the table. So things like algorithmic impact assessments are one example. We've talked a lot about business processes. So some companies have talked about or implemented, ethical review boards. Does your company come up with a set of ethical principles by which they operate, and an employee would sort of flag an issue that they think should be sent up to some sort of ethical review board? Certainly including more technical expertise in the conversations around the policy decisions, and including policy or legal folks that understand some of the broader impacts in the technical conversations. Increasing diversity are all valuable in that area. But I think it's important to consider, going with the self-driving car analogy, one debate that often arises in those circles is the question of the trolley problem. Which is, if a autonomous car is going down a road and is going to get into an accident, it can either continue straight, which point it would hit, say, there's various versions of the complexity, but say it will hit 3 people if it continues straight and doesn't intervene. Whereas if it turns, it could hit and just kill 1 person on the other side. And there are a lot of ethical questions in here. Is there a difference between sort of not intervening versus intervening? Does it matter if it's 3 children on one side and there's a 85-year-old grandmother on the other side? There could be a lot of normative issues in this very quick debate. And the reality is that cars will encounter situations like this in all likelihood if they're operating at a high enough volume. And so that's a really difficult question, and it's a really difficult ethical question as well as just a legal question when we got to the point where, there will be certainly litigation when it comes to these kind of accidents. But is the difficulty of that question so great that it means that we shouldn't build self-driving cars? Or could you make the argument that 94% of car crashes are caused in some part by human error, and autonomous cars and autonomous features can mitigate that error, potentially saving thousands or hundreds of thousands of people per year? Does the value of getting into that enterprise, is that significant enough that even though there will likely be harms that result from the way these decisions are made, is it still worth engaging in the enterprise? And I think the answer is yes, and with cars, it's certainly a more sort of extreme situation where you're dealing with sort of life or death questions. I think with some of the sort of recent crashes in the self-driving car context, some of the questions come down to how should the software be tuned? So should the software be tuned to be conservative when it comes to behavior on the roads? And I think that's something that with the recent crash is going to be a big debate. So if self-driving cars drive too conservatively, slow too much when there's someone stepping off of a curb, they could cause congestion. They could cause accidents because they won't be behaving in the way people expect them cars to behave. But if a company then says we're going to tune the software to be a little more aggressive so that it goes with sort of the norms of driving, but is a little riskier, and then a crash happens, how does accountability play in? Is that something that is sort of standard in the industry that you should increase that those reactions to accord with sort of the everyday types of driving, or should autonomous cars be more conservative than human drivers because of these liability questions? I think these are some useful analogies. The idea that there won't be impacts is sort of impractical, and so we need to think about, for the entire process of developing algorithms, implementing them, how do we create incentives for the best ethical behavior possible to ensure that, and it won't be, I think, a sort of clear checklist that we can say companies should do X, companies should do Y, but coming up with ways to incentivize for them to think about and sort of come up with best creative ways to ensure that they're thinking about and addressing these kinds of issues that might arise, even though there's unlikely to be sort of black and white answers.
I thought, I think there was something that came out last week, a new study that had said actually using one autonomous vehicle on a highway system can influence human drivers enough to actually prevent a lot of that extra braking because of the fact that they are automatically controlling their speed without using their brake light. It actually improves, all that the hard stops that you see. Neil, I want to bring you in on the conversation. Particularly, I want to go back to the question about culture. And the CKI is thinking about and finding that balance and how that plays into this discussion about competing values and how that balances with a more heavy-handed regulatory approach versus leaving things more to the market, but then you have to have that question of, well, the market's obviously influenced by culture and how you find a balance there.
Well, I think around the questions about how culture embraces new innovation, very, very interesting. I think there's been a lot of talk about techno-panics that are the usual wave of there's something that's new comes about, people don't know about it, then some people know about it and they get afraid of it, and then it kind of hits a peak of, I'm going to call it hysteria, but fear, and it's a very popular thing to talk about it, and then everybody's using it and we forget that it was a debate. And so the question is, why does culture do that? Why do humans do that? And I think in part it's because ultimately we're afraid of change. And I think thinking about how to deal with that problem from a regulatory perspective is really interesting because change is often very positive. One point I did want to address, and on the culture point, I thought Nicole did a great job of talking about how bias exists and bias is real. And Frank echoed that bias isn't just in algorithms. Obviously, it's in people. It's been there forever. And And we as society have tried to address it in a lot of different ways. And many of the biggest concerns that we often hear about AI and big data are many of the use cases, the hypothetical, those are already illegal for the vast majority of those under U.S. law. Things like the Fair Credit Reporting Act, things like all of our equal opportunity laws. The Big Data Report actually did a pretty good job of laying out all the possible things that a company might want to think about because they might be sued or they might, be brought to justice by DOJ or any of a large number of other government agencies who are looking at the impacts of a new technology. And so, so when we think about how we might address AI or big data, we should keep in mind that we have a lot of laws already around the bias problem, and that maybe those laws need to be tweaked to adjust for algorithmic problems. Maybe they don't. I don't know, but we should be thinking about it in that framework probably much more so. What do we have already? What tools do we have that we can use? And what are the gaps that are left if these aren't addressing certain things, and then think about it that way. But remember, and this is maybe to your point, maybe this is one of the things that we can do to help culture accept AI, to help society accept AI. Remember, we actually have rules about this stuff, and we do enforce them. So,
Nicole, I want to ask you to respond to a point that was raised both by Lauren and Frank. Frank talked about, IRA Magazine, there's hands off the internet. And Lauren raised, filter bubbles now, which are obviously a big issue. I think one of the interesting questions is not only, how to regulate, but when to regulate, right? So, the question now that people are talking about with filter bubbles and say maybe we need extra regulation, maybe we should treat certain companies as a media company, for example, or, and they're raising those debates. Those debates might be very valid, but the question is, were they valid in the 90s? Was it appropriate then to do it, or was it, in the 90s, was the right approach to say, what, this is new, we don't know how it's going to evolve. Not saying everything worked right in the 90s and we couldn't do it better in hindsight, but the question is, how do we decide when's the right time to just kind of jump in with new regulation? How do we, how are you thinking about finding that balance?
So I think it's interesting what Neil said. I mean, when we were talking about this, and it kind of goes back to your earlier question around privacy, right? I mean, we went through the same conversation with privacy. I was telling Kim Carey in my office, like, this is all very reminiscent of the Obama administration days when we were sitting around trying to come up with a multi-stakeholder process to talk about a privacy bill of rights. And it goes back to what Neil said at that time. We looked at what consumer privacy looked like online. We paired it up with laws that were on the books in terms of the Fair Credit Act. We started to think through, are these really principles versus statutes? Is it regulation versus what Lauren talked about, the substantiated risk? Where do we actually look at it in terms of the gradations of consumer harms? And I think we did a pretty good job sort of coming up with some principles that guide the conversation towards privacy today, where we're actually having fuller conversations. In many respects, I think the same process has to go on the algorithmic AI and machine learning side. Because as I said earlier, as many of us have already said, automated decision does not always rest on having access to the data all at one time. There are dribbles of data that actually show up. There's this concentration or these filters that actually happen at certain points of time in the life of that data. Things that you said years ago may show up later, in terms of a recommendation. There are more innocuous cases where, I want certain companies to recommend a film to me based on my behavior, my digital behavior, which may be a lot less, daunting than getting higher interest credit cards. But the question becomes, and I think it kind of goes back to the paper, regulators only know an on and off button. They only know black and white. There is no gray area when it comes to regulators, which is why we say principles, right? Or we try to think of use cases or scenarios where, like the chart that you guys presented, where you can at least give regulators a pulse point as to where they should intervene. I'm of the opinion, because we talked about this 5 years ago, and then there was this report on big data analytics, and we have seen some of these cases deepen, that I am of the point when you talk about when to regulate. I think we have enough that's out there on the federal statute side to revisit what that looks like in the online space. I don't think it would change too much what we already know about the Credit Reporting Act, et cetera, particularly since now you can apply for an auto loan online. There's just things that you can do today that you just couldn't do when many of those acts were put together. But I do think when it comes to companies, which is why I would just push back a little bit on just the operators being totally responsible, I think this question of substantiated risk is a really interesting question when to regulate. I don't know. And I mean, I'm kind of sensitive. I travel a lot. Like, I don't sit at the window anymore in an airplane. I request an aisle seat based on what my brain has programmed me, based on what I see on the news, that you have the likelihood of being sucked out of the window. So every time I got on an airplane, this is no lie, it might be creepy, it might be very paranoid, like I might be paranoid, but I request an aisle seat now, right? Because I'm just like, the cases have demonstrated that if something goes wrong, that window's gonna crack and I'm gonna get sucked out, and I don't wanna do that, right? That's just not today, one of those things, right? But I think the way that human behavior works is we're trained societally to actually react that way. And going back to the example of the FAA, I don't know if it's too late to regulate when the harm has been done, right? It's, if you take the case that I'm talking about, which was no laughing matter, you know, someone died and now we're seeing the FAA step up to sort of look at all of these engineering issues to stop another life. Or in the case of the autonomous vehicle, you know, one person dead is one person too many when it comes to innovation. And since you have this tension between policymakers who are trying to regulate on the social output, and you have technologists that are trying to regulate on the efficiency, or trying to do what's best on the efficiency side, you know, I think when to regulate, we have to actually push it away from maybe regulation, and this is sort of what you're saying in the paper, but have these multi-stakeholder conversations, much like we had with privacy, to at least begin to frame some principles. I truly believe that there's accountability, there's some level of transparency, but there's some level of fairness. And that's the same conversation we had 10 years ago with privacy. What does that look like that becomes the guiding pathway for where we trigger the use of that impact statement? Because I think there's some self-regulation that will actually happen with companies, because companies do not want to be the industry that is just really discriminatory in intent. You know, whether it's for women, people of color, people with disabilities, you don't want to be, like Frank said, you don't want to be that company, right? You want that gold star when it comes to doing the best that you can to make these processes transparent. But the challenge is consumers don't have a way to get in and be able to report in that feedback loop that says, that credit card was just marketed to me and I don't know why, right? And you then lengthen out the predatory behaviors that happen outside of the internet. So again, I think to your question of, you know, how do we decide, when do we decide? I totally agree with Neil. There's laws in place that we may revisit that are really giving us the baseline and the bright line for how we actually work through that. But I think there's a multi-stakeholder process somewhere in here where we bring in some more collaborative discussion around what are the principles that we're actually trying to do, where are the best practices, before we get policymakers. I mean, just the last thing, I think the most interesting thing that I ever see on Capitol Hill hearings now is watching policymakers debate AI and machine learning and algorithms. And I can always tell which staffer read more by the questions that the legislator asked, right? Because this is a new topic. If anybody ever wants to watch really good content, watch a hearing on this topic, because you begin to see how difficult it is for legislators to even talk about this, because they don't know where the pulse point is.
Yeah.
So it's even harder for us to do that unless you actually go through, I think, a multi-stakeholder process.
Let me ask one more question, then open it up to the audience. Friday is obviously the day GDPR goes into effect, so I don't think we can kind of leave this conversation without raising that. This gets to the question about the risk of overregulation, and also I think that, to Nicole, your point about the risk of policymakers who don't know a lot about AI. I mean, when you look at when GDPR was written, it was written at a time before most of those, MEPs, and some still probably don't even know what AI is very well, but definitely before they really understood it well and they understood the impact. And so, the question that I have is, GDPR is coming into effect. It's impacting a lot of companies right now. It obviously has a lot of rules that impact algorithms and AI. We did a whole report on the ways that we think it will be harmful, as well as a couple ways we thought it'd be beneficial. And a lot of countries are saying, well, one, should we be following in the step of Europe? And two, I think there's a question of the countries that care a lot about fairness and democratic values, and they want that represented technology. They're not necessarily I don't want to say this rightly. So China is also competing with us on AI, and there's a question. There's this kind of open question of, does it matter what Europe does and what U.S. does if we're going to cede the technological leadership in AI, because then we're also going to be ceding, all the ethical values about who's the leader in here. So let me just kind of throw that open to the panel. Anyone who wants to respond, and then we'll go to some panel questions.
So I'll just say this. So I was in a meeting with around the time of the IAPP with some European Parliament people, and we were talking about connected cars and the GDPR affecting algorithms and algorithm bias. And the leader of the parliamentarian, or one of the leaders, said, "We don't care if there's a connected car in Europe." Because we're going to have the GDPR and people have to make the choice. And I think what's interesting about that and what we're seeing actually in China, in terms of the Chinese, there's a different cultural context when it comes to data, first and foremost. So we have to acknowledge that. I mean, the United States, the Clinton administration, Gore administration made the choice for us to actually exchange our data for the internet to be free. So we have a different context for how we look at the use of our data and the reciprocal nature of that. I find that more and more when I look at other countries. They have a very protective stance on their data, which actually also lends itself to, I think, if the United States were to do anything, a lean adaptation for the U.S., which is consumer control of that data. Mm-hmm. The challenge with algorithms, though, is that you don't know the touch point in which your data sort of is repurposed and retransformed, right? You don't know if it's the point that when you pinged into the website that LaTanya showed, to just see what dates the convention were, that somehow your footprint was picked up there. You don't know if you searched for, a car loan and somehow it transferred into a retail card loan because the same broker that's buying all that consumer data. I mean, I was looking at cars the other day, and somehow I'm now getting marketed just from a look of all these new loans and deals, and I'm like, all I did was just click, Jeep Jan Kirky, and now I'm actually getting all the stuff. And I can't tell you where in the process that happened. So I think the GDPR will be harder, one, because there's not an enforceable unit to actually show how this actually plays out in the real world. But two, it'll be hard with algorithms because I think, and Frank, correct me if I'm wrong, there's so many different touch points that it's hard to say where can consumers say, I don't want this. And I think we in the United States in particular have become used to having some of these conveniences that come with algorithms, that it makes it even more trickier for us to be able to say as a consumer, I opt out of you having this, which in the end could implode another side of the market that creates that efficiency. And I'm always redirected to your data deserts, right? If I decide to be a data desert, then I also don't get certain services marketed to me because my data is not contributing to the ecosystem. So again, I think, as we look at the GDPR going through, I think that it's going to be a little tricky for the United States to take the leadership of Europe and adopt those standards full on. I don't see anything but perhaps a lean adaptation of certain principles because of the complexity of how the internet has sort of flourished and grown in this country compared to other contexts.
Yeah.
So at Microsoft and our Julie Brill, who's heading our regulatory affairs, just published a blog yesterday talking about Microsoft's compliance with the GDPR in Europe. That was pretty well known. We're also working to implement it more globally, including adopting their notion of the digital rights. This goes more towards the privacy side. I mean, look, the algorithm question becomes really complicated. I mean, one thing I learned at Data and Society is for every assumption that I thought I knew, I have a law degree from GW, I've got an undergrad in chemistry from Georgetown, I know this stuff. It's like I sit down for 5 minutes and talk to a researcher who's really dug in, and your perceptions get all confused. Automated autopilots, right? A good thing for pilots, a good thing for people, right? You get up there, but you still have pilots in the cockpit. As one of my colleagues, Madeline Tisch, found out, for like emergency, for landing, for takeoff, for the complicated stuff, well, autopilot's good, but then the pilots get blamed for anything that goes wrong. And if you think about it, they're only human. Their skills start to kind of go away because they're not flying as much as they used to because they flipped the automatic pilot on like they're supposed to. So how do you account for those sorts of things? So I raise that as an example, and it scares me actually in the judge context because I know judges, I love judges, but we're all human. Algorithms make my life easy, but then how much good? So I raise that as an example of, in Europe and elsewhere, how you go about talking about algorithms and data and, what should go in, and you start looking at the beneficial uses that might get impaired if certain restrictions are in place, and it gets really complicated. And again, trying to kind of connect some dots here, that the cultural question, I think, will come into play, both in terms of how society grapples with it. The problems of today may go away in a year or 2 years or 10 years because we just get used to it. I mean, the Brandeis, the famous Brandeis, I guess, was it Brandeis?
Yeah.
He wrote the Right to be Left Alone. It was when the Brownie camera came out. Right, that was the big privacy concern, is somebody can take my picture. Now I can buy an inexpensive camera, democratize photography. I can take a picture of someone that I may not know.
We're live streaming all of you right now.
And so, like, oh my gosh, and now, like, you walk out to the mall, it's tourist season, and everybody's taking selfies. They don't care who's around, they're taking big panorama. And all of a sudden it kind of goes, the concern starts to go away. So I think that will be part of it. This goes a little bit to your previous question. I think it will be companies adopting best practices. It will be these groups like the Partnership on AI getting together, coming up with best practices. It'll be groups like AI Now, Data and Society, name the group, also helping to kind of inform the debate. And then we'll see, hopefully, through thoughtful process, where there might be need for regulation or legislation, learning from GDPR. I'm sure there'll be lots of learnings coming out of GDPR. It'll be interesting to see what happens in China and how they actually compete with the world. They may get a lot of data sets in China, but are other places going to open up their data set, right? It's if you're data dependent, and what does that mean in the long term? But we're really encouraged by some of the legislation that we've seen, some early legislation that have been proposed around AI. We're all kind of monitoring. Everybody in the industry is monitoring, and you've got, the Cantwell, and it's a bipartisan bill, Cantwell-Young, I believe. I'm talking about establishing a commission to take a look at AI. Even around the workforce, it's the notion of bringing together, multi-stakeholder process to address those concerns. And those seems to be the right approaches for now. And let's see what comes out of that sort of process before Congress, decides to get more prescriptive on things.
Great. So let's go to the audience. We'll do a lightning round. Quick questions. Pick who you want to respond, and we'll do a couple of these. Yeah, go ahead, Steve.
Steve Del Bianco, for the call. First, I'll say to Daniel and Josh, thank you for this invaluable contribution. The context is great. And your instincts were right by suggesting that the operators had the accountability. They're the ones that hired, bought the algorithm, fed it the data, and made the decisions based on what they told them. So, Nicole, you can't hold the developers accountable. I worked for 30 years as a developer. I wrote the algorithms that Freddie Mac uses to decide whether to accept loans and American Express on approving transactions. As a programmer, the first time I am exposed to the risk of having my parameters lead to a crash of a car or lead to a bias, it's an easy solution. I turn it from a parameter to a user-defined decision. I simply stick it right on the control panel, right on the dashboard for the client. I charge him for the privilege, and I make him responsible for setting how much weight to give to black faces versus white faces when they load the data. I make them responsible for whether to run over the old lady or the 3 young children.
Right.
There's no way programmers will take that on.
Yeah.
They don't pay us enough to do that. We would simply codify it. So you should trust, Nicole, trust the instincts of Josh and Daniel, make it about the operator, and make the operators accountable for how they parameterize it. The developers themselves could never be accountable for that.
Okay, so I'm going to push back a little bit on that one. So our roundtable, we actually had operators and data scientists. So we had, and it's transparent because they all agreed to sort of be cited in this report. We had people from the banks to the healthcare providers to the technology companies to scholars from Stanford, Harvard, Cornell University, you name it. And I would say that I agree with you, but after listening to that roundtable, I think that developers also own some of the responsibility around the myopic perception of what they think the procedure will actually output. And so one of the things that came out of many of the conversations, the operators and again, this is in our discussions, tend to still be around the privacy side of this. They're not necessarily very well versed on what their programmers are doing outside of, they give them a directive that they think is ethical, will meet the business imperative. But many of the data scientists also come in with a very myopic view of the world. And that was one of the things that I learned. Some part of it is because, and I can attest to what Frank said, when we tried to put our panel together of programmers, I had the hardest challenge finding any programmer of color and women programmers. It was the big, I mean, I had to go, and some of you all know me, I got deep networks. I had to in fact, one of them, I was just invited somebody I knew to come. I was like, just please come, because this room has nobody in it. So to your point, I think there's a shared responsibility, because what we're finding in many of the use cases that I shared, that when the operator goes back to the data scientist, there's a responsibility of the data scientist to say, before they lighten the tones of African Americans, to say, my training data set is not sufficient enough for me to actually do that. And that's not the developer. Well, it is the developer to a certain extent, or the data scientist. Okay, yeah. So it's to a certain extent there has to be, and I'll frame it because we're doing our paper at University of Michigan, so Paul Resnick is handling our technical stuff. But I would say the developer / data scientist has a responsibility to say to the person who is putting the operator into the street, these are insufficient criteria, and it has a propensity towards error if we were to put this out there. Should not be a Wells Fargo, let's figure it out after a whole lot of people have been foreclosed on. There should be this conversation, and that's just the last thing. That's one of the conversation pieces in our paper, that there needs to be more collaboration, because in both of our roundtables, we found out that oftentimes in big companies, the left hand and the right hand are not navigating through that process. Microsoft actually participated, and I was just telling Frank, they actually have a very solid process where there's cross-pollination across various departments. They treat it like they do with health science, to a certain extent, health data, that there's strict scrutiny that's applied before it actually reaches and it's touched by various departments.
Let's do 2 more questions.
I still hold to my...
Will Reinhardt, American Action Forum. So obviously, thanks everyone for this conversation. It's been really solid. I have a lot of kind of separate questions from this, but one of them that I'm really interested in is this question of algorithmic accountability with regards to the durability of the effects. The PSA, which is kind of a well-known pretrial risk assessment algorithm, is used pretty extensively by at least 30 or 40 different municipalities and states. The big problem that we've seen is that even the classification scheme that comes out of that, the way that it's implemented within different regions can be hugely disparate. You know, the high classification score can be something like 10% of rearrest, or up to like 48%. And in an interesting study, it was learned that over time, the actual effects of the risk score seem to have abated. That effectively there was a regression to the mean. That over time, judges just simply didn't look at these risk scores anymore, and they became less effective because they were just kind of baked into the decision-making process that it seemed that the judges were making. So I'm just wondering, when it comes to this problem of durability, you're talking about operators. Operators should be, held culpable for this. What happens when the effects are only very, very short-lasted and then, effectively get washed out at some intermediate point or some near point?
And who are you directing that to?
Josh.
Okay.
So first, I want to specify that we are planning to do a lot more work specifically on the criminal justice space, because I think there are a lot of unique factors that affect how algorithms should be used or what kind of standards need to meet that are unique to that sector, and it'd be kind of counterproductive to focus on algorithm accountability generally and also deep dive into that. So the short answer is I'm not super positive. The longer answer is that, we really want to articulate that a judge could be a judge is always going to be liable for their decisions, whether or not they're relying on an algorithm to inform them or not. So we have to make sure that the incentives for those decisions to not be flawed, even if the actual point of harm or the actual not malicious influence, but that whether being led astray or misled a little bit is almost a flash in the pan. There needs to be some sort of way to ensure that we can protect against that. So I think there's a little bit of an analog in the healthcare space. So programs like Watson or a lot of clinical decision support systems aren't regulated by the FDA. They're not considered a medical device, but doctors still rely on them pretty heavily for diagnostic decisions. However, the ultimate responsibility still lies with the doctor. So if the doctor is basing their decisions on Watson or whatever, and not using their own judgment whatsoever, and they're consistently, making bad calls, they're still liable for malpractice, whether or not an algorithm is informing their decisions. So having that, figuring out a way to apply that sort of clarity of responsibility to the criminal justice system, to judges specifically, is a lot harder, but I don't think it's impossible.
We'll do one last question and then close. Yeah, right here. Yep, right. Oh, Mackenzie, sorry.
Oh, sorry.
Thanks. I'll be brief. Adam Eisgrau with the Association for Computing Machinery, which has done quite a bit of work in this area as well. So I have both a very brief commercial and an invitation. The commercial is, and I know that the report just released was aware of work in this area. When Machines Decide is a product of our European policy folks that just came out very recently, and a joint U.S.-European effort produced about a year ago a statement on algorithmic transparency with some suggested principles. To the question, what is the best way, because I think it's the right suggestion and the right next step, what is the best way to take many of our beginnings toward unified principles and coordinated efforts, including globally coordinated efforts, what is the best way to actually move toward an operationalization of that principles development effort? And more to the point, how can ACM help?
And who did you want to direct that one to?
I'll be really brief. So to your point about, how do we coordinate this internationally and how make sure that all the countries that value the same things we value or make sure that AI doesn't harm people and it's used to, promote human values and ethics and all that. So it's an interesting conversation because there are already efforts to do that. A lot of EU bodies and scientific advisory boards are recommending that Europe establish like a ethical standards and then adopt for their international or encourage their international adoption. The G7 is focused on this. I think their motivations are a little bit wrong. So I don't think they ever explicitly say it, but their concern is primarily countries like China. Should they dominate the market and not really care about non-discrimination, consumer protection, all the things that we value in these similar Western democratic societies, that their technologies will have a perverse impact on the global use of AI. You can pass however many international regulations and principles you want around ethics, and China could even agree to them, but if they don't care about that, they're just not going to do it. So I think a more productive approach would be I think international collaboration should focus on accelerating the development of AI, and then countries implement their own, domestic standards for how the technology can be applied. So even if China does become the market leader in AI, if they don't meet, the UK standards for how AI can discriminate or be transparent or whatever, they can never enter that market, or they have to adjust their technology until it does. So I think a lot of those efforts are a little bit, they're aiming at the wrong target, I think, but it's still an important discussion to be having.
Great. So, sorry, we're at time. We're over time, so I'll stop now. This is definitely a conversation we want to continue. I want to thank everyone for being here today. We are serious when we were saying we'd welcome feedback on this topic. So, you have Josh's contact information and our website. There's more contact information. Please send feedback after you have a chance to digest the report. We'd certainly appreciate it. And please join me in thanking our excellent panelists for their thoughts today.
Thank you.